Hello there, and welcome to another interesting edition of History of Nigeria for Secondary Schools. In this edition, I wish to concentrate on uh, a class of SS2, and we shall be looking at the transatlantic slave trade. That's our topic for today, the transatlantic slave trade. And in this topic, we shall try to define the transatlantic slave trade and say what it was all about, what caused it, what were the effects, and what led to its end. That is talking about the abolition and the abolitionist. So, as a form of introduction, the transatlantic slave trade was a trade across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. So the trade is described in many nomenclatures. That means the trade has so many names. Names like the transatlantic slave trade or the triangular trade. That's interesting. The triangular, the triangular trade. So it is referred to as the transatlantic slave trade because it involved the movement of slaves from Africa to the New World. So whenever you hear me say the New World here, we are referring to the Americas. And the Americas here include North and South America because those were the places that these slaves were taken to. So it was also referred to as a triangular trade because it involved the movement of traders from Europe to Africa, then from Africa to the New World, that is America, and from the New World, America to Europe. If you have to link that on a map, it is going to give some sort of triangular shape. I'm going to show you that on the map. So some simply refer to it as the slave trade because slaves constituted the majority or the major article of trade. So I think we can now actually define what the transatlantic slave trade was all about based on the various definitions given here. Now, if you look at this world map, partly we can see Africa, we can see South America, we can see North America, then we can also see Europe. So the arrows here are pointing the movement that was involved in this Atlantic slave trade. Now, if you look at the movement from Africa, now you have here textile, Rome, and manufactured goods that came from Europe. Then what did they take from Africa to the New World or to the Americas? They took slaves to America, and these slaves worked in the plantations in the Americas, and the plantation produce, that is sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were now transported to Europe, where they were transformed to finished goods, and they brought some of those goods back to Africa and went to the Americas again with slaves. So if you look at it, it gives us a triangular shape. So the movement, that is why some people call it the triangular trade. So let's talk about the origin of the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese were the first to engage in slave trade in the 16th and the 17th century when they took African slaves to work at Portuguese colonies of Brazil and Spanish colonies of South America. So the first set of people to arrive as slaves or labor force in the New World reached the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic in 1502. So in the 16th century, the British joined the trade and later overtook other European countries or other European nations. So the involvement of the British in this trade was a game changer. So they came in and overtook every other person who was involved in this transatlantic slave trade. So the first English sea captain to engage in the slave trade was John Hoskins. So he joined the trade in 1562 when it was realized among Europeans that African slaves were seriously needed to work at the plantation in the colonies. The Royal African Company was set up in 1672 to make African slaves available for the sugar plantations in the New World. Now, before we move further, you may be wondering, why is it that they did not take white people to work there? But there were quite a number of reasons why Africans were involved in this, why Africans were most preferred to be slaves, or to provide the workforce in those plantations. The Red Indians, who were the original or the autochthones in that region, were not as strong and resilient to the climatic condition and to tropical diseases like Africans were. So those were some of the factors that made them to consider the Africans. One, the Africans were hardworking, they were strong, they were resistant to some tropical diseases. Therefore, it was far more cheaper for them to take the Africans to enslave them to work for them in those plantations than the people who originally lived in those areas. So the transatlantic slave trade involved the sourcing and buying of slaves of African origin who were taken to the New World to work in plantations. So the major work of the slaves included working in American plantations where cash crops like sugarcane, coffee, cotton, and tobacco were cultivated. These cash crops were shipped from the New World to Europe, where traders traded them and bought manufactured goods like textile, drinks, firearms, and other goods, which they took to Africa. Now, the goods from Europe were either sold or used for barter system, where African men, women, and children were exchanged for European goods. Wow. A full-grown human being exchanged for good, for material things. Now, let's look at this map again. You see, on this map, it still shows the movement and especially the goods. So you can easily identify Africa, Europe, South America, North America. Then you have the Caribbean islands, and you have the Atlantic Ocean in the middle there. So, how was it moved? Like I earlier explained, enslaved Africans were taken from West Africa. They were taken to the Caribbean or to the Americas, either South or North America, then where they farmed. And from there, the raw materials such as cotton, sugar, tobacco were taken to Europe. And then they now bought manufactured goods from Europe back to Africa. How was this trade organized? Let's look at organization of the transatlantic slave trade. So the transatlantic slave trade was organized in 3 stages. There were 3 very important stages that were involved in this trade. Firstly, slave ships left British port to West Africa carrying such goods as firearms, ironwares, and drinks produced in Britain to come and exchange them for African slaves. When you look at firearms, that tells you what will happen. So those people who bought firearms, what were they doing with them? We're going to talk more about that. Let's see the second point. On arrival at the coast, this is the second stage of the organization. On arrival at the coast, the goods were exchanged with African children, women, and men captured by slave traders or bought from African chiefs along the coast or in the hinterland or from middlemen. So some of the slaves were hardened criminals from their communities. Well, If you were a hardened criminal, it was just easy for them to sell you off into slavery. So the slaves remained with European traders at the coast until a ship that would transport them arrived. So the journey to Europe was referred to as the Middle Passage. Let me make this clear. They remained at the coast for as long as a ship did not arrive. Even if it was going to take the ship weeks, months, they will have to wait for that ship to arrive for them to be transported to the New World. And that journey was referred to as the Middle Passage. We're going to expatiate on that. So the third stage was that as the slaves arrived the West Indies, that is the Americas, they were sold to the highest bidder at slave auctions. Once a slave is sold, he or she becomes a property of the buyer and worked for nothing at the plantation. So the slaves had no right and were treated inhumanly. Now, if you take a look at this image, you can see men, women, and children chained, tied, beaten. This image shows African slaves on their way to the coast. No matter the distance, they were going to trek from wherever they found themselves to the coastal region. You can see the level of inhuman treatment that was meted on them as slaves. Let's talk about the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage refers to the journey of slaves to the New World. It refers to the period between the takeoff of the slaves from West African coast and its arrival at the New World. So the Middle Passage, one. In the Middle Passage, a lot of things happened. The first thing was that the journeys were undertaken as from 6 weeks to several months. You're on the sea, depending on the weather as the journey was by sea. So if the weather was not conducive, you spend more time. Secondly, the ships carrying the slaves were often too small to carry a large number of slaves on board. So that means they were packed, they were squeezed into the ship in order to suit the number they needed. You can imagine that. And thirdly, slaves were tightly packed into cramped spaces with coffers. As one person tied on the right leg of another person through the chain, then the left leg of another person tied on that of the other person. So this was done to deny the slaves the opportunity to escape from the journey. Fourthly, the condition of the ships were terrible. There was no ventilation, no space, and the slaves were exposed to harsh weather conditions. The ships were overcrowded. You can imagine that. And the unsanitary conditions were alarming. As a result, we can all imagine a lot of slaves died, and some of them died from diseases such as smallpox, measles, scurvy, and starvation on this journey, such that before they arrived, a lot of them lost their life. And even along the way, if they notice that a slave was weak or very sick, they would just throw you into the sea for you to rest in pieces there with the fishes. So let's look at different ways slaves protested. Facing this type of inhuman treatment was not going to be easy for the slaves. So they protested in different ways. Some of them took on revolution. Some slaves revolted against their buyers and masters at the plantation.